they were planning to put alumina into the atmosphere, it would be beyond a joke. It would be catastrophically stupid. Hello, Chris Exley.
Hello, Chris. Hi, it's Patrick. Thank you so much again for agreeing to chat with me. As you know, I research geoengineering, and one of the proposals is solar radiation management, and many geoengineers have discussed the possibility of using alumina. And you know aluminum toxicity like no one else. And I'm not going to ask you to say, oh, I believe it's already happening, which, well, I do. But I really want to pick your brains, if you excuse the pun, on your career studying aluminum toxicity, specifically the Alzheimer's connection, how aluminum can, cause amyloid clumps and so on. Also, the effect of iron. And the debate whether, the fact that there is still a debate on whether aluminum causes Alzheimer's, finally, how silica can protect us. It has been discussed, particularly by David Keith, that we use nanoparticulate aluminum, amongst other things, barium and so on. And if this was to be implemented, what would be the human health impact of such a program?
Sure.
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, that's a slightly different approach to one that I regularly have to deal with, which is that will tell me that it's actually happening now, and I often say that there is no one on this earth who is more concerned about human exposure to aluminium than I am. But my position always comes from one where we need evidence. And we don't just need evidence that someone collected in their back garden. We need as strong and rigorous and possibly peer-reviewed scientific evidence as possible of anything where we're trying to implicate aluminium in human disease. It's difficult enough to do that with the very best science. And so this is where, to a certain extent, a lot of the use of alumina in geoengineering arguments completely fall apart. It's because there is nothing there to support them. We even did a small study here at Keele about 18 months or so ago, where we measured aluminium in rainfall. We have a little weather center here at Keele, so we were able to collect rainfall over a period of, it's a student study, so it was just over 12 weeks, measured the aluminium content of rainfall just out of interest, really. But we found nothing unusual, let's put it that way, during that period of time. So it's one for me that if, I know that even the research councils here in the UK, one of them, the EPSRC, actually had a program several years ago on geoengineering, which they've since, we are told, stopped. It doesn't exist anymore. Where they were, in the first instance, the plan was to just look at water aerosols, just as a proof of concept before they thought about using any other type of aerosol in a climate, engineering manner. And if they were planning to put alumina into the atmosphere, it would be beyond a joke. I mean, it would be catastrophically stupid, and then people like myself would be extremely vocal about it.
Well, for the sake of this conversation, let's just talk about it as a proposal. Aluminium. I call it aluminum. I've been here so long. Is everywhere.
Either's fine.
Yeah, this phone I'm using is largely made of aluminum. It surrounds us. It's in all kinds of things, and obviously I'm aware that the smaller the particle, the more bioavailable it is. Whether it's inhaled or ingested orally, there are different particle sizes. There are a lot of factors. I remember, I think it was in the 80s, the Camelford disaster. That was the first time I realized that
Yeah, 1988. Yeah.
Was that the event that got you interested in studying this?
No, I started quite a lot before then. I started when I was a student at Stirling University working on aluminium toxicity in fish. So that was 1984 when I started my work.
So that's 30 years more. You've been studying this.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been my whole academic life.
What does aluminum do when it gets inside your body? And also, there's aluminum and alumina. Alumina being Al2O3. The basically sapphire is alumina.
Yeah, there are many minerals that are made of aluminium. Absolutely right. And what you have to understand about aluminium. First of all, and to be honest with you, you can get all of this through my blog and my website and my papers. So I'm going to give you a very brief summary of it. First of all, it has absolutely no biological function in any living organism. So the only thing that we know aluminium to do is to be toxic. And we know it's toxic because it kills fish in acid lakes, it kills trees. We know that on those rare occasions where aluminium has got into human tissues, it has caused toxicity. An example of this being something called dialysis encephalopathy, where people on renal dialysis machines received large amounts of aluminium, which went into their brains. It was neurotoxic and produced a sort of immediate madness followed by death. So the neurotoxicity of aluminium, the toxicity of aluminium, all of these things are absolutely in stone. They are not controversial in any way whatsoever. The controversy really is everyday exposure to aluminium. Does our everyday exposure to aluminium, for example, contribute to chronic human diseases such as Alzheimer's disease? And again, that's a subject area that I've been working on for more or less 30 years, even in Alzheimer's disease. And it's only recently, in fact, last year, I published a paper where I put my head on the block to say that I now believe that the evidence is so strong that when aluminium reaches a certain concentration in brain tissue, it will be a major contributor to Alzheimer's. In fact, I went as far as saying that it's highly likely that if there was no aluminium in brain tissue, there would not be Alzheimer's in the normal lifetime of individuals. So it's initially you're talking about many different ways in which we are exposed, including some of the ones you talked about, and one that would be relevant in the geoengineering scheme would be potentially its uptake through your nose and your lung. And again, you might be talking about the type of aluminium being an aluminium oxide, as you mentioned, alumina. Aluminium oxides can be quite inert. In other words, if you take a grain or take a little piece of alumina and drop it into a glass of pure water, it doesn't instantly dissolve to give you free aluminium, which is the form of aluminium which is toxic. But it does dissolve over time, and in a biological environment, it is a source of biologically available aluminium. So there are almost no inert forms. Even your phone, if you dropped it into some water over time, there would be, slowly but surely, the release of some free metal from its surface. But those types of aluminium which are potentially more toxic are those that deliver the free form of the aluminium that can bind to all the biological molecules most quickly. And so, yes, you get different types of reactions and different types of responses to different forms of aluminium arising via different routes. But, one of the more worrying aspects of an aerosol of aluminium is that the route, for example, via the nose, which takes you via something called the olfactory system, it is actually a very, very efficient way of getting something into the brain, where it doesn't have to go across the blood-brain barrier. There is a route directly from the nose, from the olfactory system, into a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And we know this, of course, because it's no coincidence that people take drugs via this route, because it gets to the brain rapidly. Now, alumina particles could very quickly get to our brains because of their inhalation from the atmosphere. These alumina particles in the first instance would not be immediately toxic, well, unless they're in very, very large amounts, but that's unlikely. But they would go into the brain, and they would probably stay there, and they would be slowly processed, and they would be slowly dissolved over time, and they would add to all the other ways in which we are all exposed to aluminium in our everyday life. And so they will contribute substantially to the aluminium burden in brain tissue. And that would be a significant worry. I mean, at the moment, we are also exposed to aluminium in, you've probably heard of these things, PM10s, PM5s, PM2.5s, PM stands for particulate material. Many of the particulate materials that are naturally present, naturally inverted commas, natural is the wrong word, but which are present in the air that we breathe, also include some aluminium with them. So they are also contributing to aluminium. So it would be one additional factor, and an additional factor that personally I think it would be one too far in terms of adding to the possible toxicity of aluminium in humans.
What actually is Alzheimer's, and what happens to the brains of sufferers, as the disease progresses, and what part do you see aluminum playing in that pathology?
Yeah, well, I mean, Alzheimer's is a continuum of many ways. The first thing that happens in Alzheimer's disease is probably that neurons, which are responsible for certain activities, start to work less well. We call it become dysfunctional. So it doesn't mean that they've died. It means that they're no longer functioning as well as they should do. And these neurons then become under increasing pressure, increasing stress over years and indeed decades, and until a point comes when the neuron is no longer a viable operating system, an operating cell. And we have a system in our bodies for getting rid of cells that are no longer working properly. It's called apoptosis. It's called programmed cell death. And probably what happens is either a neuron dies because of programmed cell death, or indeed it could die from a more, we call it a necrotic insult, a more acute type insult. And once you start to then lose neurons, you're not only then impairing function, you're impairing function more rapidly, but you have no sort of regeneration. You have no ability to be able to respond to that. The robustness within the system goes. So quite quickly, once you start to get a rapid loss of neurons, you then get all of the obvious and clear symptoms of Alzheimer's that people know about. And so the disease itself may well be inherent within somebody for, say, 10 years before clear and obvious symptoms occur. And the way that we think that aluminium contributes to this is simply, or more or less, a threshold effect, because we accumulate aluminium in our neurons, in our brain tissue, with age. And depending on our environment and what we do, where we are, what we're exposed to, how we live our everyday lives, we all have different amounts of aluminium in our brain tissue. And so some of us accumulate more than others. Some of us have a more robust response to it, so the same amount of aluminium has less effect. There are many ways in which you can automatically protect yourself against things like, against Alzheimer's disease. One is physical exercise is one. And we think that the reason behind that, of course, is because, or one possible reason behind that is because one of the main ways that the body excretes aluminium is through sweating. So by physical exercise, you keep as much aluminium out of the body as possible. So there are ways and means that different people under different circumstances respond differently to an increasing body burden of aluminium or brain burden of aluminium. But at some point, the aluminium in a neuron, the nerve cells of the body, get so high It's that it either kills the neuron outright or the neuron decides to kill itself. And then you start to manifest some of the really disruptive effects that you see in Alzheimer's and the later stages of Alzheimer's.
One other question. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia, and dementia has been around a long time. Dickens was talking about aged parent, with dementia. But Alzheimer's itself is a relatively new disease. My research has shown that at least the CDC has, in 1979, they reported 847, I think, deaths. Now it's over 116,000 per year. These are US deaths from Alzheimer's. It has increased a lot. Is there, if you took a section of a brain from an old-fashioned commoner garden dementia patient victim, because this would be post-mortem, versus a brain from the body of an Alzheimer's sufferer, can you see, are there visual differences with Alzheimer's and...
The first thing you've got to appreciate is that the main risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is aging.
Yeah.
So aging is the main risk factor. So you've got more chance of getting Alzheimer's the older you are. So longevity, the fact is that obviously we now live much longer, means that we will have a higher instance of Alzheimer's disease. And so, the difference in longevity of men and women has gone up from, the turn of the last century, probably around 50 to 60 years of age, all the way through now to 80 years of age. So there's already a huge additional window in which to develop the disease. Now, in terms of what is dementia, anything which can cause a disruption in neuronal functioning, brain functioning, could be described in some ways as a dementia. So, for example, people who have a stroke often suffer a form of dementia, although that dementia can often be reversible. It can often, after a while, some of the cognitive effects can be recovered because of the ability to regenerate the tissue in those areas, or regenerate some of the connections that were lost in those areas. But to me, Alzheimer's disease is a pretty broad church, a pretty broad umbrella, which encompasses the majority of what we understand as dementia today. Other forms of dementia, which are not of the Alzheimer's type, are relatively rare by comparison. And so Alzheimer's disease is what we today understand primarily as dementia. But anything. So, for example, you can have an alcoholic dementia. You can get alcohol. There are many, many potential toxins which, upon entering the brain, could cause a form of dementia, because dementia, in that instance, is simply the death of neurons in a particular area of the brain. But Alzheimer's disease, which is, as I said, the most common form of, or at least what we understand as dementia, is something which is more progressive. It happens over a lifetime, and it is, as I said, the major risk factor for it is aging. And since we know that's one of the things that links it with aluminium, because we also know that we accumulate aluminium in our brain with age as well.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Absolutely. You wrote a paper in, what year is this? 2006, aluminum and iron, but neither copper nor zinc are key in the precipitation of beta sheets of A beta 42 in senile plaque cores in Alzheimer's disease. This is in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease.
Yeah.
So when you have iron present as well, does this accelerate the progress of the disease?
Well,
what happens?
One of the things you're always looking for is, okay, so aluminium is neurotoxic. Aluminium is present in brain tissue, but what's the mechanism of neurotoxicity? And one of the possible mechanisms, and quite possibly the most important toxic mechanism, is that aluminium is able to act as something called a pro-oxidant. And what that means is that where there is oxidative damage, let's say in brain tissue, and iron compounds are able to produce oxidative damage, if you have aluminium present as well, the aluminium produces like a tenfold increase in that oxidative damage. It's a pro-oxidant. It really accelerates the damage that might have been due to an iron compound alone. So, the relationship between iron and aluminium is probably quite a strong one with respect to the mechanism of aluminium toxicity and neurotoxicity in particular.
Oh, that's good to know. As an aside, I do rainwater analysis. I live in San Francisco, so we have relatively clean air. So I'm near the, a few miles from the ocean. And since David Keith's paper, he wrote a paper suggesting we use these little photophoretic, whatever, he suggested using particles which included aluminum, barium, titanium, and iron. So I've been testing. So when I do my rainwater analysis, I test for aluminum, barium, iron, and titanium. And my most recent one I did from last week, had, of course, aluminum was 220 micrograms per liter. Barium and titanium were present as well, but I had iron at 300 micrograms per liter. So there is also iron coming down in the rain. I'm not saying, it's absolutely from the plains, but it's present in the air at least, and the two of those things together are not good, I believe. You were doing
in terms of synergisms, or in terms of things where one can make things worse than the other. Then yes, aluminium and iron work well together in that respect. I mean, obviously, iron is something the body is used to handling, used to dealing with, and so we have many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution where iron has been involved in that process. So the body is well prepared for it. It's well prepared for the oxidative damage that iron could cause. We have lots of antioxidants. What it's not prepared for is an addition to that, which is the aluminium. So that's, aluminium is like I always call it, a silent visitor to the body. It's a Trojan horse type effect. The body is just ill prepared for the presence of aluminium, whereas it is very well prepared for something like iron. So it's their combination, yes, which could be much, much worse than either of them alone.
I've also read that aluminum and fluoride together can be quite. I mean, there's talk about the pineal gland can be adversely affected by the two things together.
Yeah, one thing for sure is that obviously fluoride is not good. It's not good. And if there was the possibility of aluminum fluorides forming in vivo, that would not be good either, because they'd be able to displace things like phosphate and other essential molecules from certain different biochemical processes. The evidence, actual real scientific evidence that aluminium fluorides, fluoroaluminates form in vivo in the body is extremely weak. There's lots of evidence where you can use fluoroaluminates in cell culture systems to produce biological effects, but those conditions that are required are so much more different than any that could really realistically occur in the body. One of my worries about fluoride is more to do with, so for example, if you live in an area where your water is fluoridated, the likelihood is that the fluoride in your water can help aluminium in your gut get across into the bloodstream. So fluoride increases the biological availability of aluminium.
Not good. And also, it goes without saying, with all of these materials, particle size matters. A surface area per unit mass. The smaller the particle, the more bioavailable it is. The more, like if you had...
in terms of aluminium, the smaller the particle, the more likely it is to dissolve more quickly in a biological medium, like a blood or some other biological fluid. It's also got a possibility, depending upon size. Size will determine how it might be transported around the body. So really small particles of aluminium, particles that might be called nanoparticles, less than, say, 100 nanometers in size, some of these particles can access cells almost independently of any other mechanisms, whereas larger particles, they need to be taken up by specific mechanisms. So yes, size is important both for accessing different areas of the body and subcellular areas as well, but then also in the rate at which those particles can dissolve to release the biologically reactive form of aluminium, which is Al3+.
Before I forget, I would like to ask you about your brain study. You got hold of, was it 60 brains? And you were studying them. Was it were you just studying the aluminum load, or were you looking at the gross pathology? Or tell me about that paper.
Yeah, well, we did a human brain study, which was published in, I think, 2012, and then another paper from that in 2013, where the first instance we measured the aluminium, iron, and copper in 60 human brains. So this was really, because we had such a fantastic opportunity to do this, it was really about trying to find out, look, how much aluminium is there really in the human brain? And so the first instance was all about really just getting the basic data. And we managed to get, in the case of aluminium, more than 700 data points for that. We did a follow-up study where we related the different amounts of metal that we found, aluminium, copper, and iron, to pathologies related to beta amyloid, which are pathologies which are related to Alzheimer's disease. And they published that also in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease afterwards. So that was a large reference study almost in many ways. And it was a very eye-opening study for me, because because we've done it, and I think we've done the very best study on aluminium in human brain tissue that's ever been measured, ever been carried out. We were very, very careful about the possibility of extraneous contamination or anything of this sort. I don't think any other study has been so rigorous. And yet, we still found, in many cases, significant amounts of aluminium in brain tissue. The reason to do this, even back so not that many years ago, is that you will still hear some people say, oh, there's no aluminium in the brain. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's ludicrous to say so, but they do say it. So you needed to produce the very best and strongest and most robust evidence to counter, silly and ludicrous arguments like that.
I've got a good one for you, which you can put in for ridiculous arguments. I was speaking to someone who, his job is to deny, oh, there's nothing wrong, aluminum is fine. And he said that what happens with Alzheimer's patients, people have, when you have advanced Alzheimer's, that then makes you more susceptible, more of a sponge to soak up aluminum. It's like, really? But anyway, yeah. that was an aside.
Well, listen, this is the type of thing that you will get all the time. The fact that aluminium is a proven neurotoxin in countless animal models, and indeed on those rare occasions where some poor individuals have had lots of aluminium gone into their brain and died a terrible death, should be enough for these individuals to realize that aluminium really is a problem, and we really don't want it in our brains.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't just accumulate at places, places of pathology. No, that's not the case.
The reason we're even speaking is I saw that wonderful Age of Aluminum documentary. I think that was the right name of it. And you were telling you were telling me that the reason you get more of a concentration in the brain is because there isn't the same cell turnover as, say, like your epidermis.
Absolutely, yeah. The neurons last for your lifetime, don't they? So they have an opportunity to accumulate. Your skin cells last a few days.
Yeah, and bones last longer. But actually, I want to sort of circle back to the brain study. I'm sure in London, the Science Museum, there must be some brains in jars that could be tested for aluminum, because if, I can imagine that people would say, well, yes, there's aluminum in brains now, but it's always been the case. Is there has anyone ever tested for metals in brains?
The problem is that we cannot, all historical brains sitting in jars are in some sort of fixative, and that's the reason why they're still there. They've been fixed in time. And we know from actual studies carried out for this particular purpose that these fixatives were always heavily contaminated with aluminium, and still are today, actually. So you cannot measure aluminium content in anything other than deep frozen tissue. So if we were to find, somebody deep frozen in a glacier somewhere or something of that sort, then maybe we could do that. But no, any fixed tissue is of no use to us.
Maybe, actually, I know it's a little gruesome, obviously, anything to do with mortality is gruesome. Perhaps some of these climbers on Everest may be able to help us out on that. Who knows?
Who knows?
I'm sure they'd be freeze-dried by now, but it wouldn't change the metal content.
If you've got to be deep frozen.
Right.
These things will think, your normal freezer is about, minus 16, 17, 18 degrees. Something in there will last for a year before it starts to break down. So, minus 80 is where you need to keep something if you want it to stay more or less constant over time. So even though, there may be some instances of individuals frozen in ice and something, the likelihood is that what you get back will be very difficult to deal with, highly likely to be heavily contaminated with any of the environment that they're in. So, we've thought about this a lot because we're very interested to know when did, I talk about the age of aluminium or the aluminium age, when did it really start? And I honestly believe that the evidence points to it starting more or less at the same time as we learned how to take aluminium ores and create aluminium metal and therefore aluminium salts. And that was at the, mid to the end of the 19th century. So aluminium is something which is everywhere is a really new concept.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've got access to my blog on the Hippocratic Post, haven't you?
I haven't actually looked there. I just went to your publications to look for
right.
it, but I will. I'll go there.
On there, there's an essay called The Aluminium Age, which I think is a really good example of, what our raison d'etre, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it's well worth a read just to get an idea of where we are coming from, where our research comes from.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I'd like to bring up, I actually ordered some nanoparticulate alumina, a 5 nanometer from us-nano.com, and the material safety data sheet says, basically it says it causes tumors. When it's injected into animals, cancer forms. And I know you've mostly been studying the Alzheimer's side of things, but could you speak a little to neoplasms?
Well, the other area, the one thing about aluminium is when the aluminium age was in its infancy, so the early part of the 20th century, there were huge numbers of publications about the carcinogenic effects of aluminium. So it was actually first recognized more as a carcinogen than anything else. And for some reason or other, that interest of aluminium as a carcinogen lapsed through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and perhaps is now making a little bit of a comeback because we work on areas such as breast cancer. And the most recent research with breast cancer really does implicate aluminium quite heavily in that disease. So, no, I'm not surprised to hear that aluminium can be a carcinogen. And bearing in mind, did you say these were 5 nanometer particles?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, these are going to be able to get access, for example, to almost to the nucleus of a cell, where aluminium can cause all sorts of damage, and therefore mutations, and therefore potentially being carcinogenic. So that doesn't surprise me. Perhaps it surprises me that it's actually written on the information. But
oh, absolutely! I'll send you the data sheet. When you order it, there's an extra $40 charge for a hazmat handling by FedEx. This is scary stuff.
Yeah,
scary stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've got some things like, the fingerprint dust that the police have used for years is made of a very, very, very fine alumina. Mm-hmm. And I've got a little jar of that on my shelf here, but I wouldn't open it. I don't want to breathe that stuff in.
No, thank you. Absolutely. It's creepy. It's bad. So silica, because the people who have been following the geoengineering thing, people say, "Oh, how do we get rid of these metals?" It was so refreshing when you mentioned when you like drink Fiji water and then you test urine after drinking silica-rich water. The levels of silica match the levels of aluminum coming out in your urine, so it does actually. Does it dislodge it?
Yeah.
How does that
not
work?
Exactly. What we're saying is, I mean, my first research was on showing that silicon protected against acute toxicity of aluminium in fish. So we now know, that silicon is the natural way in which life has been protected against aluminium toxicity since the beginning of life on Earth. So the idea really is to say, well, can we use this concept to protect ourselves against aluminium toxicity? And the simplest way to do that is to drink a mineral water which is rich in silicon. And now when I say silicon, what I really mean is silicic acid, the soluble form of silicon. What happens is that soluble form of silicon follows water from the gut into the blood, and it's able to form something called a hydroxyluminosilicate, which can then be filtered by the kidney. So it's a way of facilitating the removal of aluminium from the body. And this is an area now that, in terms of clinical trials, we ran our first clinical trial on this back in 2006 in Alzheimer's disease. So we've got a lot of research on this. We've just published one on multiple sclerosis. Again, you can access all of this through the blog or through my website. So it's all about this unique inorganic chemistry that exists between silicon and aluminium, because silicon or silicic acid has no other chemistry. So it won't react with any other metals. It won't react with any organic molecules. It only reacts with itself, actually, at very high concentrations, or with aluminium. And this is a beautiful chemistry which protects life from biologically available aluminium. And we should be using it by drinking silicon-rich mineral waters every day to protect ourselves from being in the aluminium age, as I call it.
And since we are now in the aluminium age, people will say, "Oh, well, it's the most common element in the crust. It's it's always been around. What's the big deal? Don't be concerned about Al2O3." What has changed? Is it simply refining it, brings it into the biosphere?
Absolutely. It hasn't always been around. It's always been. It has actually been excluded from biological systems, and only man's activities. And again, you read about this in the different areas I've told you and I've suggested you have a look at. But only man's activities have changed this. And primarily, the main one was how to take an inert aluminosilicate ore from the earth, and from it make aluminium metal, and from aluminium metal make aluminium salts. And these are all much, much more biologically available than the inert ores from which they came. So that's it. That's the aluminium age. It came from man's, revolution in being able to make aluminium metal. And in fact, all of modern life today has depended upon that amazing piece of technology.
And it's cheap and plentiful. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately. So, you have found out. Well, I want to thank you so much for all of your expertise on this. And I noticed that I'll put a link in here so people can support your work, because I know, didn't you have some funding issues halfway through your brain study?
Oh, listen, we have nothing but funding issues now. We cannot get any funding from any conventional sources. All of our research is now funded by philanthropy. It is impossible. No one will fund. None of the government, research councils, major charities. Aluminium is a dirty word. They will not fund it. Yeah. It's changed. It's always been difficult, but in the last 5 years, it's literally impossible. No one gets funding for this type of research. So all of our research is funded through philanthropy.
Well, I suggest anyone listening to this, if you can afford anything, send it to Chris. You're doing God's work.
We'll be very grateful, and we will put it to very good use. That's for sure.
Wonderful.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Patrick, and good luck. Good luck with your investigations.
And thank you so much. Oh, by the way, before we leave, I am going to send you some information. I came across an article in Science in 2013 clarifying the dominant sources and mechanisms of cirrus cloud formation. And they found that the cloud condensation nuclei up in the stratosphere, I'll just read the abstract. Formation of cirrus clouds depends on the availability of ice nuclei to begin condensation of atmospheric water vapor. Although it is known that only a small fraction of atmospheric aerosols are efficient in ice nuclei, the critical ingredients that make those aerosols so effective has not been established. We have determined in situ the composition of the residual particles within cirrus crystals after the ice was sublimated. Our results demonstrate that mineral dust and metallic particles are the dominant source of residual particles, whereas sulfate and organic particles are underrepresented, and elemental carbon and biological materials are essentially absent. And, so somehow, and they tested, and they're actually getting aluminum, not even alumina, aluminum being the cloud condensation nuclei. And, obviously I'm not, making one there for the other.
This is part of the basis. I mean, this is why weather control, they do use salts and stuff, don't they, to make things rain and stuff when they're needed, or to stop things from raining, depending on what they want to do. So, yeah, to provide nuclei around which you can form ice crystals and then you can initiate a certain cloud formation of something sort is pretty well known, yeah.
And the fact that these metals, I mean, these are, they're heavier than air, even though they're small, and the smaller the particle, the more it can blow around and stuff. But, they're finding metals, heavy metals up there where pollen's not even getting up there. So anyway, that's another thing. I will send you this as well.
Okay.
But yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it's good because a lot of people are just completely unaware that. Because we're so familiar with aluminum, beer cans and it's in all kinds of stuff. And by the way, also another creepy thing was this US Nano where I bought my 5 nanometer alumina stuff. Uses include cosmetics.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
they're putting.
Yeah, they're in lots of cosmetics.
Yikes.
Yep.
And of course, with the underarm deodorant, whatever. That's another thing. But again, I again thank you so much for your time, and I'll send you a link and keep up the good work.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Patrick.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.